My name is Steve Chang. I have a privilege to introduce Dr. Jennifer Mader. So Dr. Jennifer Mader is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Lethbridge. She obtained her bachelor's degree in biology from University of British Columbia in Canada, and she got her PhD in Brandeis University in Boston. Her expertise is in octopus, squids, cuttlefish, especially their amazing and highly advanced cognitive capacity. She also has a big research interest in the welfare of these animals. So now this is time, I must really confess that I watch constantly the amazing videos of octopus behavior in YouTube. If you have time, there's amazing videos out there on octopus. It always amazes me. She's also an active promoter of women in science, and she has been noted as an excellent teacher. She got one of the prestigious teaching awards recently. So no further ado, here's Dr. Jennifer Mader.
Okay, I have to confess the first thing that I want to say, which is that I am not talking about what I produced in the abstract. When Stephen asked for an abstract, I wrote something down, oh, I should look at the squid, and then I thought about it, and when I thought about it, there was something else that I wanted to say. So don't pay any attention to the abstract. Okay. Listening to a lot of people here generating very elegant and very well-controlled work, I'm reminded about the fact that, first of all, my basic feeling is I want to look at the behavior. So the level I'm interested in is behavior, not the neurophysiology behind it, not the anatomy, things I don't know, not trying to look at. The second thing is that I feel fairly strongly that behavioral analysis has to be based on a general knowledge of the animal, so that field research is very important. So this is very much field research. It suffers from the problems of field research, of course, which is no control, and it suffers from the assets of field research, which is that we know the animals are doing what they do most of the time for most of their lives, okay? So the second thing I want to say is that I know I'm covering quite a bit of information. I'll go as slowly as I can, given that I have an hour and a half, and that these will be different for you. These animals are different from any of the animals that anybody else has talked about, so there's some basic assumptions that I might not tell you and you should ask questions about, okay? Feel free to ask questions at any point. If you don't know what a squid is and you go, well, wait a minute, how does that work? I want you to know, okay? I think I am going to take this with me. Let's see how it works. Okay, so this is actually divided into two sections. The first section I call Living in a World of Fish. And I'm looking at the extent to which the squid might have a theory of mind about the potential fish predators. And the second part allows me to look at something that I think is absolutely wonderful, which is the skin displays that the squid are making to one another. And then I'm asking you to look at the potential the squid has for understanding what's in the mind of other squid, okay? So keep it in mind as I go through. Okay, people often talk about cephalopods as an alternate to the general evolutionary path to high intelligence that we find in vertebrates, particularly birds and mammals. And all of the cephalopods, squid, cuttlefish, octopuses, have in common the basic body plan and the basic large centralized brain. Beyond that, if you've heard about how octopuses behave, if you've read anything about octopuses, I thought I would try to tell you a little bit about the difference between the octopuses that I usually work with and the squid that I'm going to talk about now. Two big differences, one's ecological, one is anatomical, okay? The octopus is benthic. So the octopus lives mostly in a two-dimensional world, and the octopus has many places to hide. That's the ecological part of it. The physical part of it is that the octopus has tremendous arms, 8 arms, muscular hydrostats so they can move in any way they need to, suckers all down each arm, and 3/5 of the neurons of the octopus nervous system are out in those arms, which, as I think I mentioned yesterday, is a real challenge to understanding to what extent behavior is controlled by the brain itself and by these accessory areas in the arms. Both of them have excellent skin color pattern control, but the octopus seems to use it mainly for camouflage, and the squid, as you'll see later, uses it also for communication. Now, it's striking to me when I went, and I have to admit that I went to the island of Bonaire to do field observation because Martin Moynihan had spent some time looking at squid, and he said, oh, they make a visual language on their skin. And I thought that all the cephalopod people were excited by this. But Martin went back to studying birds and left us with the question really not properly answered. So I thought, why don't I go look? Okay. Squid are different from octopuses in the sense that they really don't have this tremendous reliance on the arms. The arms, as you can see from this picture, are much shorter. It's not that they're not used. They're used partly for posture. They're also used partly for grasping, but not as much, okay? But the skin is used extensively for signaling. And the other thing that turns out, I think, ecologically to make a huge difference is that the squid is out in the open ocean. Now, in this case, near shore, but still out in the open. So it's not hiding. It has to cope with an environment in which everybody can see it all the time. So this is where the squid live, and I might give you a little bit of information. Let's see if I can get the pointer going. This is actually a reasonable depiction of a group of squid which tend to be in a lineup. You can't see this very well, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 squid there. And they're social in the sense that they're always with one another. You very, very rarely see a squid by itself. On the other hand, from what I can see, this socialization doesn't mean much more than that. So it's much more like fish schools, that they all gather together. But I don't see any cooperation. I only see them acting as individuals who just happen to be grouped. And by the way, this is a daytime picture, which is fair. And at night, the schools disperse and the squid go catching fish. We tried following them, but they get very spooked, so we ended up not doing any more than that. So in this sense, in the daytime, they seem to gather just to gather, and they kind of hang around together, and we don't see a lot of interaction until, and again, I have to explain all these things before I start, sorry about that. They are semiparous, so they reproduce at the end of their lifespan. And both the octopuses, squid, and the cuttlefish have very short lives. Nothing like as short as the bees, which I find a challenge, but very short in the sense that 2 years is a long lifespan. These are probably about 1.5 years, okay? So the first and by far the longest phase of the life is spent in simply eating, gaining weight, surviving. And for the last maybe month of their life, they're concerned with reproducing. I used to joke about it and say that a female squid has a 2-week sex life, which I found a bit disconcerting. Okay, so here's another picture. Separate sexes, permanently separate sexes, but that doesn't make any difference till they mature, always in groups. Now, this is the Caribbean reef squid, because of course there's more than one squid species. And these particular individuals permanently live in a group of somewhere between 20 and 2. And the very small animals are often in big groups, and the very, very small animals are often in small groups. The squid have been very poorly studied because they're often in the open ocean, okay? And this particular species in the Caribbean is often near shore, so we found them at depths of 1 to 5 meters. And we were able to individually identify them, which got very, very important in understanding their sexual behavior. The easiest way we had was that many of them were damaged by encounters with fish. And while they heal well, we called this one Hook, because we could see the hook-like scar that seemed to have remained for as long as we knew them. Now, the adult males have a pattern of dots on the fin, and not necessarily the same on the other side. And we found those patterns quite distinctive. In fact, we had one that had 2 dots along here and then 2 dots along here, and we called him bald, which was really unfair. But this is only the adult males. The females and the immatures turn out to have a distinctive pattern, and in this case, this is a pattern of iridophore dots. And so we ended up calling this one lines. And James Wood actually did a paper where he presented pictures of individual squid to people who knew squid and people who didn't, and proved that, in fact, people could individually identify the animals by their appearance. So it's a very lucky thing that we could do, because what that meant is that we could follow an individual through from immaturity to death, which is only about 6 weeks, in the adult period. I've got too many things to manipulate. Okay, we did simple, basic observation. I had a research team of half a dozen people, including my husband, who did all the gut work, and we observed animals. They turned out to be fairly crepuscular. So we would observe them. Each individual would do an hour shift in the morning and an hour shift in the afternoon. And we had not the normal dive slates, but huge dive slates. And we would take notes on the dive slates, spend an hour observing, and we had usually 2 observation pairs in the morning and the same pairs again in the afternoon. And of course, we'd go back in the middle of the day and put all the data into the computers. We'd figured out what it was particularly that we wanted to know, and we'd talk about it, plan it, and then observe those specific things, come back and put them into data sets. So it wasn't disorganized. We found the squid habituated quite quickly. So we would actually simply stay as stationary as possible, except for the writing. And we found that the squid pretty soon learned to tolerate us completely. On the other hand, I used to joke about this because I'd say to people who were coming to help us, grad students, colleagues, I'd say, bring a good wetsuit. And they'd say, what? This is the Caribbean, it's 28 degrees. And I'd say, try staying stationary for 1 hour. You're going to get cold pretty darn fast, which was true. Okay, so the first part of this, I'm going to talk about living in a world of fish. If you're suspended in the water, then any other individual of your species or other species can see you because there's pretty good water clarity. And octopuses, squid, and cuttlefish have no physical defenses, no exoskeleton, no spines. So they are, in fact, a very desirable food species for everybody. And the island of Bonaire, I was very fortunate about this. The island of Bonaire has marine park designated for all the near shore. So by definition, humans are not allowed to catch the fish. And that means that all the fish species that would have been there 100 years ago are still there. And it's many, many fish species. So what you have in the squid is you have a group of animals floating in plain view of anybody who wants to catch you. Now, of course, they have jet propulsion escape, so they can leave. But in some ways, they have a difficult decision because they've got this energetic expenditure if they swim away. On the other hand, they've got the risk of being eaten if they don't swim away. So while I went there to study the skin displays, when they weren't displaying, I needed something for my people to do that would be, keep them from sleeping on the top of the water. So I found this a very interesting situation. And I thought, well, how do the squid know who's going to attack me and who's not going to attack me, under what conditions, and how do I decide what to do about it? And I'm using these subjective words a little bit carefully. So what we started doing is cataloging what fish approached them, how close, how fast. Okay, I should say that again. How close did they get to the squid before the squid did something about it? How big were they? And the only way that we could do this with variable maturity squid was to say, think about squid body lengths. And how fast are they coming at the squid? And we found approaches to the squid of 27 different fish species. It did mean we had a crash course on Caribbean fish. We'd come home at night and go, I saw that interesting fish. What did it look like? And we'd go at the book and try to figure out. But we also found that there were 3 fish species that approached the squid quite commonly. And so we were able to work at this. Now, I should say, by the way, that for the squid, I think this is an ambiguous situation. And we noticed that when we were watching the squid, if a tarpon was coming from, say, the distance of that door, first the squid is gone, and then we saw the tarpon approach. So a fish that was genuinely menacing would simply scare the squid away before we had to come anywhere near. So these fish approaches were by individuals that might or might not be dangerous for the squid. Okay. And there were 3 fish species that we saw a lot of approaches. The first were parrotfish, which tend to be large. They also eat coral. And so they're not automatically squid predators, but they were big. And there were 2 other fish species that commonly approached the squid. Now remember, a large array of species would opportunistically take squid if they could. But both the yellowtail and the barjack were, in fact, opportunistic predators. So they were potentially dangerous to the squid. The parrotfish, well, what's next? Here's a parrotfish. It's true, they eat coral. They're not interested in eating squid. On the other hand, I gave a human analog to being in a pasture with a cow. We know the cows eat grass. They're not interested in us. On the other hand, if the cow puts its head down and approaches you and the cow is 2 or 3 times your size, you head for the edge of the pasture. There's no question. Okay? Now, this is the Yellowtail Snapper. Yes, opportunistic predator. Varying in size, sometimes not usually smaller than the squid, but sometimes. And here's the third individual that we saw in Squid Encounters, the barjack. And again, very varied in size. Again, opportunistic predator. So when we looked at the categories of reaction that the squid gave to these 3 fish species, there's no reaction, avoid, which is to move away about 0.5 millimeter. So the squid would stay in their group, they would stay in the immediate vicinity, but they'd move a short distance. Or they would move, say, 1 meter or so away fairly slowly, and then reassemble as a group. Or they would move quite quickly, which we would say would be over 5 meters a second. And if they moved away quite quickly, they simply would move away from that location. And we looked at this in terms of how often do these things happen, actually. Now, remember, they're expending energy if they run away, swim away, okay, compared to staying there. On average, we found that squid would move at least a meter 8 times an hour, which means they do a lot of going away. If they went more than, say, 3 or 4 meters, we found that they would gradually reassemble in approximately the same place. So they would come back together. Yes?
I'm wondering, do squids primarily rely on vision to identify predators, or are there other ways to identify them?
It's a very good question. And the answer is that they have the analog of the fish's lateral line system, okay? So that they're very, very sensitive to movement in the water. And as far as a major predator is concerned, we think that this kind of sort of tactile perception, mechanoreception is really what you should call it. We think that this is a major feature. And in terms of whether they discriminate one predator from another, if you look at 27 different fish species, you will discover that they have totally different fin patterns, and therefore they would be making totally different deviations in the water. On the other hand, they're also very good visually. So I suspect that it's some kind of combination, and we haven't at all tested it. Good question. We also noticed that with this very sensitive skin system, that there were specific color patterns that they were making on it. So we designated the minimum as 1, no pattern change. 2, and this is a zebra pattern. It's not really a zebra pattern, but that's okay, which seems to be agonistic if we look at it in terms of the interaction with other squid, and I'll talk about that later. And a third one is a startled pattern in which they produce usually 2, but dots on the dorsal surface, and I'll be talking about that one too. And when they actually swam away quickly, they generally paled the chromatophore system. I don't think that's got anything to do with any kind of signal to the animal. I think it's probably that the chromatophore sacs are relaxing, and so the color is going away. But it tends to be associated with escaping quickly. Now, we had a lot of observations. Did I not have that here? No, I'm sorry, I didn't have that. We had a lot of observations. And we did a stepwise regression on which of the 3 characteristics, remember distance, speed, and size, which of the 3 characteristics predicted the intensity of the reaction. And we found that for parrotfish, it was distance. So they had to get closer and closer before the squid bothered to leave. And then the second step was size. With the yellowtail, there was only one characteristic that seemed to make a difference to whether the squid moved away or stayed fairly stationary or showed one of these displays, and that was their speed of approach. And with the barjack, it was distance. So it's very interesting because they must in some way be discriminating between the comparative risk of the animals, which they must somehow or other be computing by some or other of these characteristics. And this discrimination is much more significant for speed of leaving than for color change.
Metabolically.
Sorry, say again?
Is it metabolically more taxing for color change than move away for the squid?
Can you use the microphone? Because I can't quite hear you.
Yeah. Is it more metabolically charging for the squid to change his color than to move away?
Probably you would expend much more energy in movement than you would in color change. The color change is fairly automatic. Nobody has actually figured out the expenditure of energy, but different color changes, different chromatophores probably wouldn't make a difference. Okay, thank you. Now, while we were watching these animals, we noticed that this particular display that I mentioned, this diamantic dot startle, seemed to be different in form from time to time. And most of the literature, and there's a lot of literature actually, a few papers, on the cuttlefish eye dots, and that suggested that they use the two posterior ones. And then they add actually darkening of the skin around the edge and different fin positions, but won't get into that. So we thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if we can figure out why it is that we see variation in this. And I got a couple of pictures from the web, so I'll try to explain. It turns out that the very young squid don't actually use the dots, but they use what we ended up calling plaid. And where are you? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. This would be a small squid that's in transition between using the plaid pattern and the adult pattern. And there are those 4 possible locations for the dot. Now, here's this individual with 1, 2. Is this visible? Okay. Here's an individual with only 1. So we realized that it is possible for them to put dots. I can never figure out any way to say this except to talk about put dots on 4 different locations. And we realized that they didn't always do that. And we thought, well, what the heck's going on? So I looked at different situations in which the squid had dots on the skin. And it turns out, look from the right and move left, that if you move down to the bottom, they often put on dots. And when they did that, they were usually the 2 posterior ones. When they were hunting, and they would sometimes break away from the group, and because there's a group of fish there, and they just go pick a few off, they were always using the 2 posterior ones. But when they were approached, they were mostly using the 2 posterior dots. You have to keep this in mind, 1, 2, 3, 4. But they were often using the others. And we thought, okay, well, what is it that's going on? Why are they using different dots, and when? Now, this is going to take a while. So I said, okay, what we need to do when we go out is we need to figure out which dot the squid are illuminating, so to speak, based on from what direction a potential predator is approaching. Okay, so I thought, well, what do we use for a control area? See, here you are, you're a squid, you're in the middle of the water, okay? So I can't do this. Fish can approach from this side, from the anterior, and from the posterior. And if the dots are communicating to fish in some way, then they ought to illuminate these 2 if you come from there, or these 2 if you come from there, or these 2 if you come from the posterior, these 2 if you come from the anterior, okay? So if they're communicating these dots to the fish, then it should be correlated with the fish approach direction. And when I thought about how am I going to find a control direction, because I got 1, 2, 3, 4, I thought, okay, wait a minute, you're a squid. A fish can approach from underneath or from above. And in that case, there shouldn't be any directionality at the dots. Is that clear? Because this is not simple. So we had a great deal of data. You can see this, very, very many observations. And I compared approach from, let me say this again. I'm going to say this very slowly so we make sure. approach from anterior, approach from right, approach from posterior, and approach from left. And then here you have which dots the animal shows. These four need to be compared with approach from above, below. And when you do that, you find that when a fish is approaching from the anterior, they're statistically more likely to show the left anterior dot than in all the other conditions. When a fish is approaching from the right, they're more likely to show the right anterior dot and also the right posterior dot. Okay. When the fish is approaching from the posterior, it's no different than it would be if it were approaching from above, below. Okay. If the fish is approaching from the left, I'm having trouble with my dots, there's more likely to be a left anterior dot and less likely to be a right anterior dot. Yes, microphone.
I just want to know, what are the numbers? What are they representing?
It's the number of times that particular dot was illuminated, shown. Okay, so it's not a percentage; it's a number. Okay.
I think what he's asking is why 28 more likely to happen than 135. That's the question, because we kind of see the big numbers, and then you say 16 is more likely to happen, but there are bigger numbers. So.
Yeah, they're always compared to the dots that would be shown if the fish came from above and below for the statistical comparisons. That help? They don't just do one dot. Okay. So what this tells us is there's a higher likelihood of addressing the startle in the direction to which the fish approached. Okay. Now, when I was looking at these numbers, never having looked at this before, I thought, wait a minute, is there a left-right difference, regardless of what direction the fish is approaching from? And I looked at it and I thought, oh, there's one in there too. And this is quite interesting because any animal that has major bilateral brain division, generally speaking, ends up with some specialization for one half of the brain for one activity and the other half of the brain for another activity. Okay, so we have, if we're right-handers, left for language and right for spatial. And in fact, it turns out that all three cephalopod groups have some lateral specialization, and it tends to be the right for vigilance behavior. And while I hadn't looked at it, I can see that this is clearly what's going on there as well. But that's a neural thing. That doesn't have anything to do with the fish. Yes?
What influences the dots? Like, is it linked to the blood flow, or do the dots influence like the direction which they will go, like they will escape?
I don't think it's got anything to do with any of that. Actually, all the cephalopods have a fantastic skin display system. It's a completely different motor system. And I will talk a little bit about it when I talk about signaling to one another. Okay, so it doesn't have anything to do with blood flow. They're elastic sacs, which are pulled out by muscles. It doesn't have anything to do with it's generally coordinated with movement situations, but it doesn't have to be. It's a separate system. Okay, completely separate system. A very sophisticated one, too. Okay. So these data suggested to me that two things, really, and I think it's important to realize the two things. First of all, there's a huge posterior bias okay? But secondly, there is some modulation depending upon which direction the fish is coming from. And of course, I presented that the winter after I'd done the observations, and somebody said, how do you know they're not signaling to the nearest squid? And I said, well, I don't, but I'll go find out. So the next year, we looked at the position of the dots and the direction of the nearest squid. And all the chi-square, and of course you can't look at above below at that point. So we had to compare them with one another. None of the chi-square comparisons were significant. Okay. So that's a clear indication that these dots are being produced towards an approaching fish. Very sophisticated system. Clearly several biases in it, but even with the biases, we could find out that it was somewhat directional. And I should say, by the way, the dots in the approach direction of fish, we were able to get 708 observations. And with the dots in direction of nearest squid, 338. One of the good things about this, even though it was field work, is it had lots and lots and lots of observations. Now, why would the choice of the dots in this startled display be only modulated? Why don't they just do the 2 left when the animal's coming from the left and the 2 right when the animal's coming from the right? I think to some extent it depends on the predator species. I think there's probably an inherent bias towards the posterior ones. But I remember several times watching a squid displaying the startled display to a barjack. Now here's the squid. I need 8 arms like the octopus. Here's the squid, and the fish is coming from here, right? And the squid turned direction so that its dorsal surface was facing the barjack and illuminated the 2 posterior dots. Okay? So instead of illuminating the dots, I guess that's what you call them, towards the predator, it turned and produced the favored dots towards the predator. So there's a variability. They're clearly addressing it towards the predator, but there's a great deal of bias and some predictability. So I would say to some extent this startle is an emotional reaction to a predator, but on the other hand, it's directional. Now, I should say also that in terms of these careful calculations, that it was much more common to the herbivorous parrotfish, the fish that wasn't going to eat it but wasn't necessarily safe, and never to the yellowtail. And I do not know why that's true. But the lack of signal to conspecifics suggests that it is a complex display, a complex controlled system, but not particularly sophisticated in the sense that it's always giving these 2 dots here and these 2 dots here, okay? Now, the next thing, I'm very pleased to be able to talk about this here, because when I came here the last time and I talked about octopuses and octopus potential minds and communications, Adrian Ward was one of the individuals who's here as a student. And he said, in conversation, and the conversations in this group, and I hope it's the same for everybody, is for me, the conversations outside the talks have been the most fascinating. And he said, well, you know, how do we know if they're calculating the risk? And we figured out that maybe we could look at juveniles versus adults, because we're assuming that adults have learned to more carefully calculate. So we did a series of comparisons. And yes, it does look as if the adults have a more sophisticated, careful risk calculation than the juveniles. And this brings me to theory of mind. So we would call it a cognitive system that predicts or explains the behavior of another agent. postulating that the agent has some kind of inner state. Now, I don't think I'm ever going to prove that the fish have an inner state that makes them figure out whether it's worth attacking the squid. But it's potentially there. And you have to remember that octopuses in particular, but squid as well, they don't seem to have a lot of motivation for carefully differentiated reactions to conspecifics, except during courtship. And so in a way, when we look at theory of mind in squid, it's equally possible that they're calculating the mind, or more likely the motivation, of heterospecifics rather than conspecifics. If you're solitary, it truly doesn't matter what the individuals of your own species. And by the way, the cephalopods are cannibalistic. So the risk posed by conspecifics may be equal to the risk posed by fish. So Adrian said, well, maybe theory of mind predicts that they can distinguish predators' motivation, or in the case of the parrotfish, of course, it's not actually a predator. And that this might, as I said, improve across the lifespan. So here's a couple of comparisons. If you look at the movement speed to non-predators, you can see that it doesn't vary with juveniles and adults. But the movement speed with to potential predators, the juveniles are faster. We might argue they're jumpier. And if you look at the percentage of movement type by juveniles and adults to non-predators, low risk, versus predators, high risk, you can see that the juveniles are more reactive to non-predators than the adults. At the same time, they're less reactive to the real predators. Okay? And is it at the medium distance that the threat is really big? If you haven't gone when the predator comes up to about 0.5 meter, it's too late. But if you've gone at 3 meters, maybe you've wasted your time. Is there a careful calculation that you need to make at a medium distance of about 1 meter, maybe 1.5 meters? And if you look at the percentage of movement type at this medium distance, you find that the juveniles are much more likely to go away, whereas the adults are likely to make a lower reaction and avoid or moving slowly away. So it looks as if at this medium distance as well, the juveniles are more jumpy. And so again, we looked at the percentage of reaction distance and the proximity of the potential predator, and we found that actually the juveniles were more likely to let a potential predator come close. They weren't very likely, but in the adults, they never let a potential predator come close. The adults were much more likely to be carefully calculating for the potential predator and move away at a medium distance. Okay, so it looks as if the adults have learned much more about potential risk between predators and non-predators and between different distances, and that the juveniles are still learning what must be a very complicated calculation. So what if the predator is the same size as the squid? One might argue that a predator that's the same size as the squid is actually not a threat. And I think that's probably true. So if you look at the juvenile, you find that they're more likely to flee, even if the potential predator is the same size. Whereas the adults seem to have made a calculation that the risk isn't very high and they're more likely to simply avoid, not go away quickly. So what does this tell us about cognitive ability? It suggests that they are performing risk calculation for each fish and probably each approach. But I think they are sorting out the different species. And presumably they have learned about the risk from previous approaches. Remember Hook with that nice little scar. I think that they are always wary of fish. But in this particular case, and this is of course one of the problems even with field work, you very, very rarely see predation attempts. So all of these animals, in fact, that we observed were not in immediate danger from these approaches, but they were wary. And so they were having to make inferences about the threat, calculations about the threat. But the real huge threat of the horse-eyed jack or the tarpon, they'd gone long since. So these are kind of carefully calculated. How bad is it, the situation? How much energy should I expend in order to get away from it? And they were making appropriate reactions. And it's not a long lifespan, remember. Year and a half, and most of the year and a half you're about this big or this big. It looks as if they were improving in their risk calculations. Still. No, I really don't know about squid cognition. But what I see suggests that there is some kind of calculation going on, that there is a theory of mind, but I'm quite sure it has nothing to do with the theory of mind that we have. Totally different situation, totally different ecology, totally different physiology. Nonetheless, I think there is something there. And I'm still struggling with this problem of having to say about the octopuses as much as the squid that there is no safe place. There's no juvenile period during which your parents nurture you and teach you, okay? The juveniles are floating off in the open ocean. They're about that big. And the egg of an octopus is often the size of a rice grain, and the paralarvae simply float off in the open ocean and come back. So there's no friends. And they're cannibalistic. So even all the rest of their lifespan, there's no friends. And for me, this is difficult to calculate. But I know that it is a reality for these animals. Always, always, always at risk. I'm going to switch to something else. Does anybody have a quick question?
What do squid eat? Like they eat each other, but are there instances where they can eat the predators or other fishes or the type of stuff?
They commonly eat fish. And I am quite sure that if a juvenile of one of the predatory fish put itself in risk, that the squid would eat it. Okay. So, but they commonly eat fish that are much smaller than themselves. The fish gather together in schools, and the octopus something comes up to the school and starts picking individuals off. It's not very nice. Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick question. I'm sorry if I missed this, but the purpose of the 2 dots, is that to make it look like eyes to approaching fish or something?
Sorry, say again?
Are the 2 dots meant to make it look like eyes or something? Like you see that in butterflies? Or...
Okay. Evolutionarily, I think they are meant to make them look like eyes. But I'm quite sure that the squid has absolutely no idea of what an eye looks like, and that I shall imitate it. It must have been something that was the result of evolutionary pressure.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
How do they manage the risk of being in a school during the day when they are cannibalistic?
They are cannibalistic to much smaller individuals. So they tend to sort into schools that are approximately the same size. I have no idea to what extent they do this sorting. One year we were out there and there was a school of adults and a school of juveniles and a school of very tiny individuals. And I did actually see a juvenile eat one of the tiny individuals. Okay, so it must be kind of a yin-yang thing that they're pushed to grouping with each other, but they're avoiding bigger individuals. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand how you can how you include the theory of mind in the learning of the squid. I'm not sure I understand why.
Okay, well,
it's theory of mind.
They're always, let me say this again, they're always at risk from fish. Yeah. But there's a lot of fish around that they're sort of almost maybe at risk from. And they have to figure out who they're at more risk from, what the characteristics are, probably also the motivational level, though I don't know how to figure that one out, of this particular individual, whether this individual is someone I can afford to ignore, or whether this individual is someone that I'm going to have to flee from and waste energy.
Yeah, but why would it be theory of mind and not just some sort of classic learning?
Well, it seems to me that the theory of mind is calculating what's going on in the brain of the approaching individual. Let's talk about that more at the end, because it's a very important question. On the other hand, let me give you a little bit more information, okay?
Okay, thanks.
By the way, this is a baby squid doing plaid, and I couldn't resist it. It's also doing an arm position that I called bad hair, because it looks like it's having a bad hair day. It doesn't have anything to do with the communication with one another, it's just too nice. Okay, as they become adults, squid have a variety of relatively stereotyped displays, which are involved in sexual and agonistic interaction. And I'm going to focus on one of them, but I thought I'd mention a couple of the others. This is a female and a male, and she's doing what we call saddle, and he's doing what we call stripe. And this is the sort of the first stage courtship. That's camouflage. That's the couple of dots down by the bottom of the land. That's another saddle stripe. That's another plaid. These are juveniles who are making specific stripes. They're also near the bottom, probably. Sometimes they do go to the bottom. This is the basic color that we would see during the daytime. This is Hook again. And this is a male squid who's doing what's called a lateral silver. He will be the consort of a female who's here. And if she's looking at him, she sees the same thing as you see here. Yeah, right, every day. And all the other squid will see this bright, semi-transparent white, which is a keep away signal. Okay? Mostly the other squid do keep away. And we found that this is shown by a male who's consorting with a female who's at least 2 meters away from the rest of the group. And it's really very much a keep away signal. This is a zebra, and this I'm going to show you about because this is an agonistic pattern, mostly male, and no self-respecting zebra would look like that. But it's very much graded as very, very big variation in intensity, which I've looked at. There's a little bit of zebra here, and there's clearly zebra there, and there's zebra on the arms. Now, it wasn't my definition. It's borrowed by people from the cuttlefish who make a zebra, which really does look like a zebra. No self-respecting zebra would ever look like that. But there we go. Now I want to tell you a little bit about the skin visual display system, because I've left that through the risk part. And again, it's not cells, it's a whole system. Here's the elastic sac with the pigment, and here are muscles which right now are relaxed, but which can pull it out. So it's sort of like pixels on a TV screen, except expansible. Okay? When it's contracted, you won't see anything. The chromatophores come in black, brown, red, orange, or orange, yellow. Okay? And when they expand, you can see this color, these colors. They can expand all the yellow, or they can expand all the black, or they can expand all of them. They have very, very good neural control. Beneath the chromatophores, visible when the chromatophores are contracted, are leucophores, which are broadband reflectors, and iridophores, which are only in the squid, which can produce specific colors, which are modulated to some extent by the direction you're looking at them, but they also turn out to be hormonally modulated, and we don't know enough about what that means. There's also, though this doesn't show, there's muscles in the skin which can raise papillae so that the individual can change the apparent texture of the skin. That's more common in octopuses. So direct neural control to chromatophore muscles and some myogenic transfer from chromatophore to chromatophore. Developmental changes, unfortunately, too. Major selection of patterns, modulation, and production. It is a phenomenal system. Squid are the real chameleons. What can the system do? It can change in less than 100 milliseconds. It can change over very, very specific areas. Nobody's worked it out, but probably less than a square millimeter. It can send displays to multiple receivers. So it can send to fish. And in fact, this zebra that I'm going to talk about is produced to fish, but it is predominantly produced to conspecifics. Interestingly enough, they are not color sensitive. They have only one photopigment. So the octopuses, the cuttlefish, and the squid all have no color sensitivity. But particularly the octopuses, what they produce is very, very closely tuned to fish color sensitivity. Very interesting to think about. And I'll tell you about the multiple receivers later. Okay, it's probably reasonable to think of a display pattern in terms of elements, chromatophores, leucophores, iridophores, skin. As I mentioned, there's muscles in the skin, but they also change posture in order to emphasize something. They have background colors, units. I could show you eyebrows. I'll show you a mid-dorsal line, fin, mantle dots, different units. Foreground components, bars, stripes, dots, splotches. Posture and position, with the result that you can have either a chronic pattern. Remember that brown that I showed you? The squid would have that brown on for most of the day, except when something interesting happened. Or acute displays. So the saddle stripe might last for a few seconds. The startle would last for a few seconds. The zebra might last a little longer, okay? But there's chronic patterns behind that are normal and the displays that come on for a very short period. The result is that every cephalopod species would have a repertoire of fixed displays, and we think it's about 10 to a dozen. We haven't got enough to know. But, so you can recognize, for instance, the dot startle. You can recognize the saddle and the stripe. They are made up of components, but we think they combine to make a recognizable pattern in about 10. Okay, so they're good. Now, if squid have a language, what would it look like? And because I went to look at the language, even though I'm talking a little bit about theory of mind, I will look at it in this case through looking at their communication with one another. They have many combinations. I think this is probably a female doing a zebra to an approaching male. I can't see his dots well enough. Notice that she has brown outer fins, zebra on the mantle, a little bit of extra brown, and probably there's a bit of zebra underneath the brown on the arms. She's got what we called golden eyebrows and mid-brown in the center of the head, okay? he's probably doing what we call a flicker. And unfortunately, that's temporally modulated, so you can't see it. It's kind of a lilac color flickering on and off. So there's a wide creativity. There's many little pieces that come together. Okay, I'll stop and explain about directional sending and receiving because I think it's very important. I need 2 hands for this. Okay, so they have lateralized control. Okay, so if you're a squid, they can and do send one display in one half of the body and send another display, completely different but full components, to another side of the body. Now, in the case of lateral silver, which I showed you, what that means is you can say nothing's going on to the female beside you, and you can say bug off, get lost, go away to everybody else. Okay. But I have a couple of pictures, and other individuals have noticed this in other squid and cuttlefish, that they can send one motivated display, a sexual display that, say, a male can send to a female, and then can send a completely different display indicating aggression to a male. I can't do that. That's like talking out of both sides of your mouth. Okay? And what this tells me, I'm running out of time. That's what that tells me. Okay. I think this is important to say, so let me say it. Okay? That these sexual skin displays are not completely controlled by motivation, because they can send one there and a completely other one there. So they must be making some kind of deliberate calculation of what to display to whom, not completely controlled by their motivational level. I'm going to have to hurry this one. I was afraid of this. Here's the zebra display. And it's interesting to look at the zebra because it's a recognizable signal used to communicate with conspecifics. It has a very great deal of variation. So these are all zebras. Now, this is a male receiver and a male producer display, but you can see 840 and 64 zebras by male to male and 1 by female to female. So everybody makes it to males. And based on the whole skin, okay, we calculated an intensity score based on the intensity of the dark, remember it can be varied, and the contrast between the dark and the background, and the amount of area that it was displayed on. And also, and it's important down at the bottom, you saw that one animal with the spread arms, which is increasing the apparent area. And this is where the zebra is seen. Now, we found when a male was guarding a female that there were many, many, many different locations where the zebra could be seen, many different combinations, all of which are essentially saying the same thing: go away, get lost, mine. Now, this is important. I've managed to find a few of these. Here's the female on the left, the male who's guarding the female, and another male. And the intensity of the zebra varies between the guarding male and the intruding male. Okay? It's always a stronger intensity for the guarding male. When the guarding male comes closer, the zebra intensity increases, but it continues to be the case that the guarding male is making more intense zebra. Okay? So an agonistic signal, it varies depending upon where the other guy is, and it also is always stronger for the guard than for the intruder. Now, this is important to say. Usually, the quote-unquote winner makes a more intense zebra. But this varies with circumstances, which is quite interesting, because after this sexual flicker display, often a smaller male, a peripheral male, will try to disturb the process of mating, and in that case, we see that the intensity of the agonistic signal is not a predictor of the resource capacity. So the zebra can be deceptive. It is usually an accurate signal of resource holding potential, but it can be deceptive. And in these cases, we found that this disrupted courtship. Now, in these guys, this is the only deception that I see. But in other squid and cuttlefish, there are deceptive signals by males which are allowing them to mate with females because they're deceiving the consort into thinking that they are a female. At higher intensities, they have ritualized contests. And I was quite struck by this because there's no physical contest. Notice the characteristics for ritualized communication: warning, conspicuous redundancy, stereotypy. This is a male-male zebra contest. The lower one wins. The lower one has much more intensity of the zebra display. They rise above the group. Longer duration, actually. Escalation, they start off with zebras, because in fact I saw this and I thought, well, wait a minute, how do they know who's going to be in what position? But they arise and jockey for position and display lower intensity zebra before they get to this stereotyped contest. And the winner, I'm doing my best. The winner is high intensity display, and the winner is also underneath position. So they're intensity units. The units of contrast, the units of darkness, the units of spread, they're all increasing the intensity of the zebra. But there are things that we call accessories, and we tried to look at this. It turns out that brown fins are usually there when the signal is more intense. You can see the zebra is much more intense in that particular case. But this is a fin-based stripe, and if you look at it in the left-hand male, you can see it's accompanying zebra, and it's actually to another male. And if you look at it on the right-hand side, you see there's no zebra with it, and it's signaling to a female. And this is also seen in a sexual display. So we think that it's a different component which may be signaling a maleness, which ends up being shown at the same time as the zebra, but was not a component of the zebra. And of course, there's these guys that they can do double signaling. What does this tell us? Bilateral control, knowledge of receiver characteristics, and separation of signaling from affect. Does that mean it's a display language? Not according to Hawking's characteristics, because Hawking says that a language should have comment on externals. Complicated as this is, interesting and variable as this is, it all seems to be about signaling about self. And I'd love to talk to somebody about that. Definitely a complex communication system. Maybe. It's the first step. I don't think it tells us what's on a squid's mind, but it helps us to begin. And my thanks is to the people who came to Bonaire with me, floated in the water, wondered what was going on, talked about it forever, and were fascinated by squid. Thank you. Okay, I'm sorry I had to rush at the end, so maybe people have questions about the rushed part that I can answer. But please.
Go ahead. So I wanted to return to the earlier question about theory of mind in reference to the predatory fish, because it seems like a sort of old school behaviorist would have absolutely no trouble explaining the fish's behavior in response to the different, the squid's behavior in response to the different fish species in that case, or it sort of doesn't matter whether they have using your own definition of them having an internal mental representation is sort of irrelevant to the story. They just sort of recognize three different classes of external things in the environment, and there's different risk associated with those three different things, and they respond differently to those different things. But I don't see why the notion of theory of mind would apply to that case.
I think there's probably an initial calculation of the differential risk of the different species. But the fish, too, have different motivational levels. I was always struck by their reaction to the barjack, because the barjack are predators. On the other hand, the squid seemed to somehow or other calculate just exactly how serious the barjack were, just exactly whether they should worry about them. I'm not sure. We need to know more. But in the natural environment, there's a huge number of variables that the squid have to take into account. I suspect the fish are taking into account too, but I don't think you can say, I see a yellowtail. I know what the yellowtail does, and so I will always do some kind of response to the yellowtail.
So just to follow up on that, because I think that's an interesting idea. So, I mean, if you wanted to show theory of mind, wouldn't it be better to be able to show that squid responded differently to different yellowtail? Not that they treated all yellowtail as a class and sort of had a certain risk that they associated with all yellowtail, because that kind of pushes against the idea that there's some sort of internal representation of an individual yellowtail.
Remember, we looked at size, distance at which they reacted, and speed of approach. And in the case of the yellowtail, the only thing that made any difference to what the squid did was speed of approach. So those other variables didn't matter for yellowtail. They did matter for barjack. And I don't know why. So in that sense, the behaviorist isn't taking into account the kinds of things that the squid did. Okay.
Just a comment about Adam's question. So many times animals have to trade off. They need to feed, for example, or court, and deal with potential threat. So knowing what the intention of the predator can definitely help. Meaning some predators are just in the environment, they have to be somewhere, but they're not into trying to capture prey now. So, so knowing exactly what the predator intends to do could be relevant. But my question, you made a very interesting point about solitary species. You need to look at theory of mind in relation to other species such as predators. But then every solitary species also has sexual behavior, which means interacting with other individuals. So there are male-male interactions and male-female interactions where you would have theoretically theory of mind issues. So how do you answer this?
Sorry, exactly what is the question?
You initially made a very good point that in solitary species, we shouldn't look at within species interactions. But
Right.
I'm saying they still have sexual life, which means within species interactions. So I can definitely imagine rich theory of mind in relation to within species interaction.
Right. I think there must be both. That when it comes to the sexual behavior, and I haven't had a chance to talk at all about how that's organized, that they must, but I mean, who said you had to have one theory of mind? We don't have one theory of mind, do we? Do we have a theory of mind about whether it's safe to go in traffic and another theory of mind about whether that guy over there is interested in me? Yeah, I agree.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I guess my question is about the dot communication system that you showed. It seems like it's not a very reliable and efficient communication to indicate where the predator is coming from. It seems like it's probabilistic and not always the case that the location of the dots is corresponding to the location of the predator.
Sorry, I'm having trouble sorting out the question.
Yeah, okay, so I haven't asked the question yet. So basically my question is have you looked at whether or not the display of the dots is conditional on the proximity of other squids? And also, have you observed some reactions from the squid? Is the escape of the squids that would be in proximity to other squids basically related to location of the dots of a squid that is nearby?
No, I was surprised because they're obligate members of groups, and I saw very little sort of cross within species communication with one another. So a fish could attack or come very close to this individual, and this individual might move away a little bit. I really didn't see any perception of sensitivity to the risk of others. I mean, I really thought that since they were obligate members of groups, they would be more social than the octopuses, and honestly, I didn't see it. Until they became reproductively ready, and then they were carefully calculating a lot of things. Is that what you asked?
Well, then, what is the function of the location of the dots? And when they get a fish approach a squid, you showed that the location of the dots are going to change, right?
Well, presumably the dots are communicating to the fish. You see, if you think about it, the two real eyes are anterior, quite close together. And they don't necessarily look dark. If you have these two dark eyes, it's a larger surface area. And especially if it's communicated to the fish.
So there's no communication.
Presumably in some cases it says, really, I'm bigger and nastier than you thought I was.
Okay, so I guess that wasn't a question. I was wondering if it was communicating information to other squids, but it's only for the fish and the predators.
That's right.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was surprised because the fact that they're obligate members of groups doesn't seem to mean that they're in any way communicating with one another until they're adults. It doesn't seem to have any sort of behavioral specialization. They just seem to be with each other because they're with each other, much like many fish schools.
So I noticed they have eyes quite lateralized.
That's right, they're lateralized. Good for you.
What do we know about how segregated or integrated the processing of the information from those two sides of the world is?
Long ago in Naples, in the 50s and 60s, there was a series of studies of visual categorization. Okay, and what they found was that if you taught a visual discrimination to an animal, feeding it through one eye, and this is octopus, remember, and then you immediately tested it to see if the discrimination was known with the other eye, that it was not. But if they came back the next day, they found that it was known if it was presented in the visual field of the other eye. So there's a storage of information which is initially unilateral, but spreads to bilateral with some time.
And was there sleep in between those two tests?
They weren't very sophisticated.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, but it is really interesting because it means they're mostly, but not completely bilateral.
In humans, women tend to be better at theory of mind tasks, both from a cognitive and affective theory of mind perspective and the first and second degree theory of mind. So are female fish, squids, better at it, or do they tend to survive more predatory attacks? Or
I don't know. And I'm not sure that in humans, females are inherently better, or it's just that from our inferior position in society, we learn to recognize more subtle cues. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I've been very interested in cephalopods in recent times. So I read the book by Peter Godfrey Smith.
Yep.
And I think he was speaking about cuttlefish, which, if I'm not mistaken, also have displays on their skins. And he said that there were some reports of them just displaying random patterns, complex patterns, without any other being except the observer around. So I was wondering if there's any interpretation for why they would like be displaying things on their skin patterns without any predator or courtship mate or something like that.
Well, squid never have nobody around.
Yeah, that's true. They're so
which
small,
makes
yeah.
life quite difficult. If you look at octopuses, which I know much more about, they have, when they're hiding, they have a fairly stereotyped, reasonably uninformative pattern, but it's there, okay? And as soon as they come out of hiding, they immediately camouflage against the background very, very specifically and competently. So I don't think they ever have no display.
Okay, so they're always.
Yes, they're always on somehow.
And I had a second question. I don't know if she should go first or if I can. Okay, my second question is not related to the skin display, but to the fact that they have fairly autonomous nervous structures for each tentacle, at least octopus.
Arms.
For their arms, yeah.
Well, actually, this is terribly confusing because octopuses have 8 arms.
Yeah.
Squid and cuttlefish have 8 arms and also 2 tentacles, which are extensive and capture fish, very elastic. So it's confusing, but they're not tentacles. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So in their 8 arms, they have fairly autonomous nervous structures that can integrate the information and even show learning specific for each arm, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't think anybody has ever tried to teach something to an arm, and how could you?
Yeah.
Because the information would go to the brain. You actually could do that because there are several octopus species who autotomize or cast off an arm.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you tried it, and nobody has tried it, you could see what kind of learning an arm could do. And I am sure that because it's a chain of ganglia.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a nerve cord. So I'm sure there are lots of low-level decisions that could be learned by a ganglion.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to know the continue of the situation when the squid had 2 bedrooms between the female and the male.
Yeah.
What do you think that he's really doing? He is. I think that you have to do some examples.
So here's a male squid.
No. I understood, but do you think that he is preparing himself to fight with the other male, or he's just hiding the female? Just
okay.
What?
Trying to figure out how to explain this. The agonistic zebra can be completely shown on one side of the body at the same time that a complete and recognizable stripe display is shown on the other side of the body. Okay. And in each case, it's shown to the appropriate individual. In each case, it has all the normal components. Mm-hmm. Okay, and it can be held for seconds.
But what, because you said deliberation, decision, and I'm trying to understand what happens later on. If you have some examples, that the other male gone away, and he approximates comes near to the female. What happens? What happened?
Well, he would probably do a courtship pattern.
Okay.
I think in some sense I tried to talk too much, but the squid are fascinating. Okay. So a female will initiate a courtship. She would, and in fact, in that picture, there was a picture of a female who'd risen above the group and done this saddle display. And there must be chemical cues because it was 1 or 2 days during which she would make a saddle display and nobody was interested. Okay. And then a male and a female she would do saddle and he would do stripe. And that's very affiliative. And they would do that during consortship. And in that case, there's a relative position of the female here and the male there. And the male could vary the amount of stripe and the female could vary the amount of saddle. And they did these displays simultaneously. I was quite curious about that, and I found that they did them simultaneously, but they were more likely to make the displays during initiation of the pairing or during the possibility of interruption of the pairing, where another male would come in and would be repelled, and then the male would come back to the female. So they would do, this was affiliative. Now, at some point, the male would do what we ended up calling a flicker, which was an on-off, on-off. And again, the female would be here and the male would be there. And the female would answer with several different displays. She might answer with a saddle. She might answer with an agonistic zebra. Or she might come next to him and they'd do a parallel rocking. And he would only transfer spermatophores to her successfully if she had responded with the rocking. Okay, so it's a courtship sequence. It's not terribly complicated, thank goodness. Okay?
Thank you.
But a male might display a zebra to another individual at the same time that he was displaying the affiliate of the stripe to the female. And he would stay with her, presuming that the other male didn't manage to disrupt the courtship. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, you talked about how they only reproduce at the end of their lives, and you also talked about how they seem to have evolved a sophisticated learning system that allows them to gradually reduce their false positive, like swimming away from non-predators, these kind of examples when they're young. And eventually they get to reproduce. So do you think it may have something to do with the evolution of those gradual learning capacities instead of developing just complex reflex systems that are more kind of hardwired? Or because in my mind it should be the opposite, but then I'm not an expert on evolution, so
that's a bigger question than the squid.
Yeah.
Okay, and one of the ways to answer it would be looking at humans. It turns out if we look at newborn babies have very obvious reflective motor responses. These are gradually replaced at about age 6 months by things that they have learned. So I think in some sense, immediate survival at high risk suggests that you should have the right responses there immediately. And actually, when we look at paralarvae squid, if they're approached by a potential predator, they have very stereotyped responses. So it's probably the same kind of thing. You begin your development, you've got to have the automatic responses, or you're not going to be alive long enough to generate the learning. It's a really interesting problem because learning is very adaptive in terms of flexibility, but you've got to survive the learning process. And I think for every animal, there's probably some kind of combination.
Okay, so that would explain the false positives.
I would think so, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.